I woke up to a white-hot pain behind my chest that felt like someone had shoved a fist through my rib cage. My knees gave way. Eggs scattered across the tile, cracking under the weight of my own body. A stranger called 911. I remember the ambulance ride, the sirens blurred, the antiseptic smell, the cold weight of a hospital gown against my skin. My mind was oddly clear. Call my parents, I thought. But I didn't know the truth yet. The people who were supposed to be my anchors weren't coming. Not because they couldn't, because they didn't want to. My name is Dulce. I'm 33 now, but 5 years ago, I was 28, living alone in a small studio in Hartford, Connecticut. I worked as a staff accountant, paid my bills, and took my cardiac medication faithfully. That was the surface. Beneath it, I carried a quiet, gnawing fear. Every call to my parents ended the same way. My mother would answer, Meredith's laughter in the background, and my mother would say, "I'll call you back, honey." She never did. Not for birthdays, not for emergencies, not ever. That Tuesday, my world tilted. I was diagnosed with an acute aortic dissection, a heart condition that needed immediate surgery. I was wheeled into the OR, unaware that my sister Meredith had answered the call to my parents, standing in the doorway of their country club brunch, and said words that would echo for years. "She's not our problem anymore." The surgery lasted 6 hours. I woke to machines, to monitors, to silence. No flowers, no jacket draped over the chair, no one holding my hand. Only the nurse beside me, Nora, whose kind eyes gave me the first sense that someone, somewhere, still cared. If you're watching this and feel the weight of being ignored when you needed help most, subscribe now. This channel isn't about revenge, it's about quiet strength, about reclaiming the life that's yours. I spent weeks recovering, navigating bills I didn't have the money for, a job unsure if it would still exist, and a family that hadn't called, texted, or visited. Every Instagram post from them mocked my absence. Brunches, vacations, holidays, 3 chairs in every photo where I should have been 4. And yet, in all that, one person had been silently watching. Uncle Richard. He was the one who would change everything, the one who would hand me an envelope that wasn't just paper, but a choice, a way to reclaim my life. The first week home felt like walking on broken glass. Every step hurt my chest. My arms trembled from the medication, and the staples holding my sternum together ached like tiny reminders that I had survived something that should have killed me. I had no one to help carry groceries, no one to remind me to rest, no one to just sit quietly with me while I breathed. For the first time, the silence was deafening. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, a pile of hospital bills staring back at me like they were judging me. $180,000 before insurance. My copay alone was more than I made in a month. I had to figure it out myself. It wasn't just the money, it was the abandonment, the realization that my family had made a choice. Meredith had celebrated life while I was fighting for mine. My parents hadn't called, hadn't checked in, and somehow that hurt more than the scar on my chest. Scrolling through Instagram became a ritual of quiet horror. Brunches, vacations, parties, every photo a reminder that I didn't exist in their lives, that I had been erased. My CPA exam passed. Meredith had already called them with her news before I could even tell my mother. Each like and comment on her posts felt like a lock sealing me out, a confirmation that the family narrative had been rewritten without me. But there was one exception, Uncle Richard. His voice, when he called on my birthdays, steady and warm, had always reminded me that someone saw me. When he told me years ago, "Don't let them rewrite your story, kid," I hadn't understood. Now, after surgery, after the silence, I did. I kept every text, every email, every screenshot. Not for revenge, not to shame, not to post online. I kept them to remind myself of the truth. That was my anchor. That was my evidence against the years of erasure. And it was also my first act of reclaiming my own narrative. If you've ever been invisible to those who should have loved you most, subscribe now. This channel is for people who are tired of being erased, for those who need to stand quietly, firmly, and take back the life that belongs to them. Somewhere in the middle of this quiet storm, a knock came at the door. A man I barely recognized stood there. Mid-50s, silver at the temples, calm in a way that made the chaos around me seem small. He smiled gently. "Can I come in?" he asked. It was Uncle Richard. And in that moment I realized that the choice I had been waiting for, the one to reclaim my life, was finally within reach. Uncle Richard stepped inside slowly, letting the door click shut behind him. I noticed the way he carried a thick manila envelope under his arm, like it weighed more than paper, like it carried history, truth, and maybe even justice. He didn't rush. He didn't hug me or offer false comfort. He just looked, really looked, at the scar across my chest, at the trembling of my left hand, at the way I held my mug like a lifeline. "It's been a long road," he said softly. "I wanted to make sure you were steady first." I nodded. I wasn't used to being treated with that kind of care. Most people, my family included, measured my worth in money spent or effort required. Richard measured it in presence, in attention, in quiet vigilance. We sat at my kitchen table, the one still littered with bills and severance letters. He placed the envelope in front of me, letting it rest there like a third presence in the room. "This is yours," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. "I've been keeping an eye on things for years. You don't know what your family has done behind your back, but I do. And I made a decision for you." I felt my pulse spike. "What? What is it?" Richard shook his head, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Not today. You need to rest first. I'll come back Thursday. Bring your folder, the one with all your records. We'll go through it together." And just like that, a sense of calm settled over me. For 5 years, I had been invisible, erased, rewritten in my family's story. And now, someone had chosen me. Someone had decided that my life, my heart, and my choices mattered. If you've ever felt erased by people who were supposed to love you most, hit subscribe. This space is for those of us reclaiming ourselves quietly, for those who need to know that choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's survival. I spent the next few days preparing. Every email, every screenshot, every unanswered text and Instagram post, all of it organized. Not for confrontation, not for revenge, but so I could never doubt my own memory again. Thursday came, and I felt a strange mix of fear and anticipation. Richard arrived exactly on time, as steady as ever, carrying the envelope that promised more than money. It promised choice, clarity, and finally, a life built on my terms. That envelope would change everything. But first, I had to decide if I was ready to see what had been kept from me all those years. And that choice was mine alone. Thursday morning arrived quiet and pale, sunlight filtering through my blinds like it was hesitant to witness what was about to unfold. Uncle Richard set the envelope on the table, sliding it across slowly, deliberately. He didn't speak, didn't rush me. I could feel the weight of it, the culmination of years of absence, betrayal, and quiet observation. "I want you to read this yourself," he said softly. "Everything here, it's yours. No one else." I made sure of it. My hands shook as I broke the seal. Inside were papers in his neat, careful handwriting, blue ink forming words that had been waiting for me for years. Properties, accounts, instructions. He had placed everything in an irrevocable trust. He had made me the sole beneficiary. 3 houses, a savings account. Everything he had built on his own, quietly, methodically, now belonged to me. I felt my chest tighten, not from pain, but from the weight of choice. Not revenge, not triumph, just the clarity that comes from someone finally looking at you and saying, "You are worth choosing." Richard's voice broke my reverie. "You don't owe me anything, Dulce. You owe yourself a life worth living. You've earned the right to decide. Not them, not anyone else." I held the papers, read and reread the words. Years of being erased, ignored, rewritten, all of it crystallized in this quiet act. I realized then that justice doesn't have to shout. It doesn't have to humiliate. It simply exists when someone honors truth and gives power to the right hands. If you've ever been pushed aside, overlooked, or dismissed by people you trusted most, subscribe now. This channel is for those who are reclaiming their narrative, for those who know that quiet strength outlasts anger. Richard leaned back, watching me, letting the silence stretch. I didn't cry, didn't smile. I just let it sink in. For the first time, I was standing on solid ground that wasn't borrowed, manipulated, or conditional. He stood, placing a hand on my shoulder briefly. "Rest, Dulce. Think about what you want. The rest will follow." And with that, he left. But not before leaving the envelope, the key to my autonomy, on the table. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, the air feeling different, lighter, full of possibility. For the first time in 5 years, I realized the story I had been living didn't have to match the story my family told. I had a choice. And this time, it was mine alone. For days after Uncle Richard left, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the envelope. I didn't open it again. I didn't need to. The papers inside were more than documents, they were permission. Permission to choose myself, to stop being invisible, to stop letting my family decide my worth. Then the phone rang. Meredith. My chest tightened, the familiar dread knotting inside me. She never called late. Her voice was flat, careful, almost exhausted. Dulce, I saw your post, the one you shared about everything. I held up a hand. Wait, let me finish first, I said quietly. For the first time, I realized I could control the conversation. Not Meredith, not my parents. Me. She paused. Her silence was awkward, unfamiliar. I took it down, she said eventually, voice trembling. I can't post a correction. Everyone already knows I lied. I let the words hang. Not triumph, not anger, just acknowledgement. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to justify my pain to her. I wasn't going to let her rewrite me again. And then the subtle, grounding thought came. This is my life. My choices. My rules. If you've ever felt silenced by those closest to you, subscribe now. This channel exists for people who are reclaiming themselves, who understand that boundaries aren't cruelty, they're survival. A week later, my parents came to my door. Patricia's hands were trembling around her purse. Gerald's jaw was tight, measured. Meredith hovered behind them, sunglasses on indoors, like she could shield herself from the truth. But this time, the power wasn't theirs. I didn't flinch. I didn't hesitate. I let them in, but only as guests in a life I had rebuilt without them. I know what you want, I said, voice steady. You're here because you need something. I understand. But before we talk about anything, you need to know I am not your burden. I never was, and I will not be again. They stared. Gerald's eyes flicked to the envelope on the side table. Patricia's hands trembled. Meredith's sunglasses couldn't hide the tension in her face. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply set the terms. Quietly, firmly, irrevocably. That afternoon I realized something essential. Reclaiming yourself isn't loud. It's steady. It's consistent. And when it's done right, no one can argue with it, not even the people who tried to erase you. I led them to the living room, where the envelope lay untouched on the side table. I didn't reach for it. I didn't need to. Its presence alone was enough, an unspoken reminder that the rules had changed. This was no longer their story to control. I'll make this simple, I said. My voice was quiet, steady, the kind of tone that doesn't invite argument. You are here because you need help. That's clear. But if anything in this house is going to remain yours, you need to understand the terms. Meredith leaned forward instinctively, like she could read ahead in my mind. Dulce, we just want to… Stop, I said. She froze. Gerald's jaw tightened, and Patricia looked down at her clasped hands. The terms are straightforward, I continued. 1. You pay rent. Market rate. Not a gift, not a favor. 2. Meredith, you delete the post. The one rewriting history. Or the lease doesn't exist. 3. No interference with my life beyond what is agreed in writing. They all blinked. Silence stretched, tense, fragile. I didn't flinch. I didn't soften. I simply let it hang there until the weight of truth settled. If you've ever been forced to choose between family loyalty and your own dignity, subscribe now. This channel is for those learning that standing firm doesn't make you cruel, it makes you free. Meredith sputtered. You can't be serious. I am, I said, each word deliberate. I am serious about my life, my space, and my choices. If you can't respect that, you're welcome to figure it out somewhere else. I will not repeat the past. Gerald's face twisted, a mixture of disbelief and frustration. Patricia's lips trembled. Even Meredith's composure, polished for years, cracked just at the edges. But I didn't cheer. I didn't gloat. This wasn't revenge. This was the quiet enforcement of boundaries they had refused to respect for decades. I watched them process. The room was still, save for the soft crackle of the fireplace. For the first time, I felt the calm that comes from claiming your own authority, not through volume, not through anger, but through clarity and consistency. That evening, I stepped out onto the porch, autumn air crisp and clean. I sipped chamomile and realized The hardest part wasn't their resistance, it was the years I had waited for them to choose me. Now, I didn't have to wait. I was choosing myself. Every day, in every decision. The next morning, Helen Marsh arrived with the lease for the Maple Street cottage. I had asked her to prepare it exactly as Uncle Richard had instructed. Market rate rent, first 2 months deferred if they couldn't pay immediately, all terms clear and non-negotiable. This was the only way I could help without giving up my boundaries. I laid the stack on the coffee table. Gerald's eyes widened slightly, and Patricia's fingers twisted the strap of her purse nervously. Meredith's sunglasses sat perched on her head, though she still avoided direct eye contact. "This is the lease," I said evenly. "It's for 6 months. Market rate. All terms are spelled out. Helen has copies for you." They all blinked. Gerald's jaw worked silently. Meredith whispered, "You're charging us?" "Yes," I said. "Because you charged me for being alive. You counted every dollar spent on my heart. Now, we start on equal terms. Everyone pays their way." Helen handed them the copies. Gerald signed without looking at me, his pen scratching across the paper like a reluctant confession. Patricia signed slowly, hands trembling. Meredith hesitated, then finally complied, the sunglasses sliding down just enough to reveal the tight line of her mouth. I didn't say another word. I simply watched them absorb the reality that for the first time, I was not a silent observer, not a subordinate, not a line item in someone else's ledger. I was the one holding authority, setting the rules, enforcing fairness. If you've ever been dismissed, erased, or manipulated by people who were supposed to protect you, subscribe now. This channel exists to remind you that quiet strength is your most powerful tool, and standing firm doesn't make you cruel, it makes you free. When they left, the house felt different. Not emptier, not louder, just calm. The sugar maples outside swayed in the October breeze, and I realized that the weight I had carried for years, the fear, the doubt, the constant need to be validated, had finally lifted. For the first time, I could breathe without thinking about whether I had done enough to earn someone else's care. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. I simply acknowledged that I had chosen myself, and that choice was all I needed. That evening, I sat on the porch with a mug of tea, the crisp air filling my lungs. Quiet justice, I realized, doesn't shout. It arrives softly, steadily, and it leaves you with something far more enduring than revenge: clarity, freedom, and the knowledge that your life belongs to you and only you. A few days later, Meredith called. Her voice sounded different, flat, tired, stripped of the usual performance. "Dulce, I just wanted to say I took the post down," she said. No apology, no excuses, just fatigue. I held the phone, letting the silence stretch, not because I wanted to punish her, but because I realized that my response didn't have to validate her, didn't have to soothe her ego. This time, it was about me. I said quietly. "That's enough for now." She hesitated. I can't post a correction. Everyone already knows I lied." "Then let them know the truth through their own eyes," I said. My voice was calm, reflective, not judgmental, just firm. "You've had your moment to control the narrative. Now it's mine." Meredith went silent. I didn't fill the space. I let her feel the weight of choice, something I had never had before, growing up in a family that rewrote my story for decades. The next evening, I walked the Maple Street cottage property, my hands in the pockets of my jacket, watching the sugar maples sway in the breeze. Gerald and Patricia were inside, moving slowly, as though navigating the rules I had set for them. Their silence was different this time. It was the quiet acknowledgement that the balance of power had shifted. If you've ever been erased or dismissed by someone who should have seen you, subscribe now. This channel is for those who are reclaiming their narrative, learning that boundaries are not cruelty, they are survival. Meredith never reached out again after that. Not to argue, not to manipulate, not even to watch. I realized the post had already done its work. The truth was out. The family had no stage, no audience, and I had claimed my story. I spent that evening in the quiet of my living room, sipping chamomile and thinking about Uncle Richard's words. "You don't owe anyone your suffering." I finally understood them. Choosing myself didn't mean I hated them. It didn't mean I needed revenge. It meant I valued my life, my heart, and my future enough to stand on my own terms. And for the first time in years, that clarity felt like freedom. The mornings in the Litchfield house became a sanctuary I didn't know I could have. I woke slowly, letting the pale gray porch catch the first light of day. The air smelled faintly of damp leaves and earth, crisp with early autumn. Buckley, the cat who had shown up that February and refused to leave, stretched along the railing at my feet, twitching one paw in a dream I would never understand. I sipped my chamomile tea, the warmth seeping into my hands, grounding me. This small ritual medication, tea, a few quiet minutes was mine, uninterrupted, untethered from anyone else's expectations. No one dictated my pace. No one questioned how I spent my mornings. Physical therapy was next. The first sessions felt like punishment disguised as recovery. My chest ached, my arms trembled, and the staples in my sternum reminded me of every moment I had endured. Each small victory standing a few seconds longer, walking an extra block felt monumental. For the first time, progress was measured by me, for me, not by comparison to anyone else's approval or neglect. Returning to work was equally quiet but profound. I started with freelance accounting, then transitioned into a staff role at a small local firm. The commute was short, 8 minutes through quiet streets lined with birch trees, their leaves turning gold in the October light. At the office, my contributions were valued, my presence respected. No one counted the cost of my life in dollars. No one measured my worth against a ledger of medical bills or mistakes. For the first time, I existed in a world that recognized me not as an inconvenience, not as a problem, but as a capable human being. Evenings were reserved for presence and quiet joy. Nora drove up from Hartford every other weekend. We cooked, usually poorly, laughed over our mistakes, and shared stories long into the night. Uncle Richard came regularly, bringing food, stories, and a calm presence that required nothing from me but attention. Carol called on Sundays, her voice warm and steady, not clipped or distracted. Every interaction reinforced the truth I had slowly uncovered over the years. My life, my choices, and my boundaries mattered. The envelope sat on the side table untouched. Its weight wasn't in the documents or money, but in the recognition it represented. Someone had believed I was worth choosing. That clarity anchored me more firmly than anything else ever had. I didn't gloat. I didn't relive past grievances. I simply acknowledged it. I was no longer invisible. If you've ever felt erased, overlooked, or undervalued by the people you trusted most, subscribe now. This channel exists for those reclaiming their lives quietly, for those who understand that strength doesn't have to shout, it simply is. For the first time in years, I didn't wait for anyone to call, to visit, to validate me. I lived. I cooked, walked the yard, made a life that was small, steady, and entirely my own. The sugar maples outside swayed in the evening breeze, gold against gray, as if nodding to the rhythm I had chosen. Freedom wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, deliberate, and enduring. I could feel it deep in my chest, the space once filled with fear, longing, and abandonment. It had been replaced with something steadier: clarity, choice, and the quiet knowledge that I had finally chosen myself first. And that choice, I realized, was enough. The morning air at the Litchfield house was crisp, sharp, carrying a faint scent of wood smoke from a neighbor's fireplace. I sat at the kitchen table, reviewing the envelope again, though I already knew its contents by heart. Uncle Richard had given me more than assets. He had given me clarity, authority, and the power to define my own boundaries. Today, we were going to put that power into action. Richard arrived mid-morning, calm and deliberate. He carried himself with the same quiet confidence that had defined him for years, the kind of presence that doesn't need to assert itself loudly to command respect. "We'll go through the lease together," he said, setting his portfolio on the counter. "I want everything to be transparent. You're in control." We walked through the documents slowly. Every term, every condition had been structured to ensure that my family could no longer manipulate me. The cottage lease market rate, with deferred payments only if necessary, was ready for Gerald and Patricia. Meredith's Facebook post had to be removed before any terms would apply. Every clause reinforced the idea I had fought to grasp for years. Boundaries could be enforced, quietly but decisively. When they arrived, their reactions were immediate. Gerald's posture stiffened. Patricia's hands clenched the strap of her purse. Meredith's sunglasses hid her eyes, though the tension in her jaw betrayed her unease. I didn't flinch. I didn't soften. I simply set the rules, calmly, clearly. "You are welcome here," I said, "on these terms." Any deviation and the arrangement ends. That is not a threat, it is the reality of your choices. Meredith sputtered. You. You're serious? I am, I said. Not loudly, not angrily. Simply, evenly, firmly. I am serious about my life, my space, and my decisions. The past is not a guideline. This is the present. Helen, standing nearby, distributed copies of the lease. Gerald signed first, without looking at me, his pen dragging reluctantly across the paper. Patricia followed, trembling. Meredith hesitated, her hands tightening around the paper before finally complying. The room was quiet, save for the soft crackle of the fireplace. No applause, no drama. Just the subtle, enduring weight of truth settling into place. If you've ever been manipulated, erased, or silenced by people you should have been able to trust, subscribe now. This channel is for those learning that reclaiming your life quietly is more powerful than any confrontation. That strength is measured by endurance, not volume. After they left, the house seemed different. Not emptier, not louder, just calm. The sugar maples swayed in the breeze, gold against gray, and I realized the lesson had already begun to sink in for them. Power isn't just in money or history, it's in the clarity of boundaries, the consistency of rules, and the refusal to let others define your worth. For the first time in my life, I was not just surviving, I was living, on my terms. The days that followed were strangely quiet, not silent in a comforting way, but heavy with the invisible weight of choices made long ago. I watched, from my porch, the subtle shifts in my family as the terms I had set began to take effect. Gerald and Patricia arrived at the cottage on the first of the month to deliver rent. The sum was straightforward, market rate. No pleading, no excuses. Just the tangible reminder that the consequences of their past inaction could no longer be ignored. Meredith didn't call. She didn't argue. The post had been removed, or rather, it had vanished under the weight of truth that was finally visible to everyone. Her social media silence was louder than any apology she might have offered. And in that silence, the consequences of her manipulations rippled outward. Friends she had counted on for support drifted away. Those who had trusted her narrative began asking questions she couldn't answer. Slowly, quietly, the truth she had hidden for years surfaced, and the world outside my living room reflected it back to her. I went about my own routine, physically weaker but emotionally stronger. Physical therapy, work, walks through the neighborhood, cooking with Nora, Sunday calls with Aunt Carol, evenings with Uncle Richard. My life was steady. It wasn't spectacular, it wasn't dramatic, but it was mine, and that steadiness allowed me to watch the unfolding consequences with clarity rather than malice. If you've ever been erased, dismissed, or manipulated by someone you trusted, subscribe now. This channel is for people reclaiming their narrative quietly, for those learning that calm, consistent boundaries create effects that can't be ignored. Quiet justice doesn't need fanfare, it arrives naturally when the rules are enforced. One afternoon, I noted Heng cashied at the local grocery store. He hesitated at the produce aisle, eyes briefly meeting mine, no acknowledgement beyond a small nod. Patricia followed slowly behind him, her expression guarded. They were navigating a world in which their previous control had evaporated. They were experiencing, in small increments, the weight of accountability without drama, without confrontation, only the sober reality of structure and rules I had implemented. Meredith's absence became a quiet echo through the community. Where once she had curated her image, now she moved unseen. The people who had applauded her posts now received nothing, no validation, no performance, no influence. The power of her narrative had been quietly reclaimed. From my porch, I watched the sugar maples sway in the breeze, gold and copper against gray skies. I sipped my tea and let the calm sink in. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. The consequence wasn't revenge, it was reality, structured by clarity, consistency, and the strength to say no to a life where my worth was determined by others. For the first time, I understood the quietest form of power. It isn't loud, it isn't flashy, it is steady, it is enduring, and it is entirely your own. The mornings continued to feel sacred. I would wake before the light fully touched the porch, sip my tea slowly, and listen to the quiet hum of the neighborhood waking up. Buckley, curled at my feet, sometimes stretched lazily, sometimes simply watched me as if reminding me that presence itself could be a comfort. Each day, I felt a little more grounded in the reality that my life was mine to shape, free from the invisible strings my family had once tried to pull. Physical therapy sessions became more confident. My chest no longer ached with every step, my arms no longer trembled uncontrollably. I walked longer distances around the neighborhood, noting the changes in the leaves, the patterns of shadows along the streets. Each small step of movement felt like a reclamation, a reminder that my body and my choices were under my control. Recovery wasn't just about health, it was about trust in myself, trust that I could exist independently. Work settled into a rhythm that I had never known before. The small accounting firm in Litchfield became more than a paycheck. It became a space where my effort mattered, where my presence wasn't weighed against past debts or medical costs. I filed reports, reconciled accounts, and walked home with the quiet satisfaction of a day done on my own terms. My colleagues never asked about my family. They never questioned why I lived alone, why I had no one to cover for me. They saw results. They saw dedication. That simple acknowledgement, untainted by comparison or judgment, became a foundation I hadn't realized I'd been missing. Uncle Richard remained a steady presence. He would visit on Sundays, bringing groceries or telling stories from his contracting days, but mostly just sitting quietly, letting the room fill with normalcy. Nora came every other weekend, her laughter a balm after weeks of solitude, her easy companionship a reminder that connection could be chosen and cultivated rather than imposed. Aunt Carol continued her calls, steady and warm, a tether to family history that had always been gentle and unfiltered. These relationships were chosen, cultivated, intentional. They were not transactional. They did not measure me in cost or inconvenience. The envelope from Richard remained on the side table, untouched. It was not wealth that defined its importance, but recognition. Someone had noticed me, chosen me, and built a structure where I could thrive. That choice, made quietly years ago, shaped the rhythm of my daily life. It was a constant reminder that stability didn't have to shout. I spent long afternoons walking the yard, taking stock of the garden beds I had planted along the south fence. Herbs, tomatoes, and a few wildflowers thrived under my care. Each green shoot reminded me that growth required attention, patience, and nurturing. Just as I had tended to my life, so too could life flourish under care. The sugar maples along the drive swayed in the gentle wind. Their leaves, gold and copper, shimmered even as the sky turned gray. Standing there, tea in hand, I understood something that had taken years to learn. Living steadily, deliberately, and on your own terms is a form of quiet triumph. Not loud, not spectacular, just enduring. And in that endurance I found my peace. A week after Gerald, Patricia, and Meredith moved into the Maple Street cottage, I received a call from Helen Marsh, Uncle Richard's attorney. "They're asking about the estate," she said, her tone calm, precise. I took a deep breath. I had anticipated this moment, but anticipating it didn't make it easier. For decades, my family had assumed I would defer, accept, or remain silent. Not anymore. I drove to her office later that afternoon. The small firm smelled of aged wood and fresh coffee, a quiet anchor from my childhood memories with Richard. Helen laid out the request. Gerald wanted access to details about Richard's properties. Meredith asked if she could manage the cottage finances, and Patricia called to confirm rent arrangements. I listened, steady, letting her words settle. None of this surprised me. What mattered wasn't what they wanted, it was what I chose to grant. "Everything is managed through the irrevocable trust," Helen said, opening the portfolio. "The terms are clear. Dulce controls what is released, and your authority is limited to what she allows." She glanced at me. "It's all structured to prevent manipulation or coercion." I nodded. That was the power I had reclaimed: clarity, legal structure, and the authority to enforce boundaries. My family could no longer rewrite my story, no longer leverage my health, my inheritance, or my time to suit their convenience. The trust existed precisely to protect me from the pattern I had endured for years. Driving home, I reflected on the subtle shift in our family dynamic. Gerald and Patricia had always approached life as if control equaled love. Meredith had treated attention as currency. And yet now the natural consequences were settling in quietly. They were no longer in a position to dictate, manipulate, or erase me. Their influence was limited by the clear structure I had inherited through Richard's foresight. Back at the Litchfield house, I walked the property slowly, letting the evening air fill my lungs. Each step across the gravel felt deliberate, grounded. The sugar maples swayed gently, casting gold shadows against the gray sky. I realized that this control, this ability to choose, was more than a legal victory, it was emotional freedom. The estate, the documents, the envelope, they were symbolic of something larger. The right to live without being erased, to dictate my own boundaries, and to reclaim the narrative of my life. I prepared a brief, calm note for Helen to send to my parents. It outlined the trust, clarified my authority, and reaffirmed the terms of the lease. No accusation, no drama, just clarity. The silence that followed was heavy, but steady. It was the quiet reminder that authority exercised wisely doesn't require anger, it only requires consistency. For the first time, I felt the weight of my choices settle in fully. I wasn't just surviving my family's patterns anymore. I was thriving despite them, anchored in the knowledge that clarity, structure, and firm boundaries could create a life of steady, enduring peace. Days passed with a quiet tension that filled the cottage like an invisible current. I didn't need to contact them. I didn't need to confront them directly. The consequences of their choices of years spent ignoring, erasing, and manipulating were beginning to manifest naturally. I watched the patterns unfold, detached, steady, as though observing the seasons shift. Gerald appeared at the local grocery store one afternoon, pausing mid-aisle, eyes flicking toward me before quickly looking away. He hesitated over the produce, his hands lingering over apples as if uncertainty could be measured in weight. Patricia followed, slower, more deliberate, shifting her weight from foot to foot. Their discomfort wasn't performative. It was real. For the first time, they experienced a world in which their previous control had limits. A world where their ability to rewrite someone's life had vanished. Meredith's absence was even more telling. She stopped posting online entirely. Where she had once curated her image meticulously, brunches, vacations, celebrations of privilege, now there was silence. Friends who had once celebrated her narrative began asking questions they could not ignore. She had lost her audience, her stage, the amplification that had allowed her to manipulate our family for years. Slowly, invisibility became her reality. And I watched it unfold from a distance, not with glee, but with the quiet awareness that patterns, when confronted with clarity, inevitably correct themselves. At home, life moved forward. I tended the garden, trimmed the herbs, harvested tomatoes, and let the rhythm of daily tasks anchor me. Each decision, each action, reinforced the structure I had built. A life measured by choice, not by external judgment. Work provided purpose, not validation. Nora's visits brought laughter without expectation. Uncle Richard and Aunt Carol offered presents without control. I had cultivated a network of support that operated on respect, not manipulation. The envelope remained on the side table, a symbol of authority, foresight, and protection. Its significance wasn't in the value it held, but in the choice it represented. Someone had seen me, believed in me, and ensured that my life could continue on my terms. That quiet empowerment radiated into every interaction, every decision, every walk through the yard. The sugar maples swayed in the autumn breeze, their gold and copper leaves shimmering against the gray sky. In that gentle movement, I recognized a truth that had been elusive for years. Power isn't about confrontation. It isn't about shouting, proving, or humiliating. It is steady. It is subtle. It is enduring. And when exercised with clarity and calm, it creates consequences far stronger than anger ever could. I didn't gloat. I didn't seek revenge. I simply watched. The quiet ripples of responsibility, accountability, and consequence moved naturally through my family's world. And for the first time, I felt a sense of completion, not triumph, not joy, but a steady, unshakable peace that comes from reclaiming your life and your story. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon when Meredith showed up at the Maple Street cottage. I hadn't called her, hadn't expected her, yet there she was, standing on the porch with her usual polished appearance, the sunglasses, the designer coat, but the confidence I remembered from years past seemed thinner somehow, frayed at the edges. I opened the door and let her in, silently setting the terms before the conversation even began. "Sit," I said softly, indicating the living room chairs. "I assume you know why you're here." She hesitated, lowering her sunglasses just enough to reveal her eyes, tight with unease. I wanted to talk about everything," she said carefully, almost rehearsed. Let's be clear," I interrupted. keeping my voice calm, steady. I didn't call you. I didn't invite this conversation. You came here of your own accord. Everything I say, every boundary I enforce, is my choice. You are here as a guest in a life I have built, not as a critic or as a judge. Her jaw tightened. She leaned forward, hands clasped together. Dulce, No, I said, firmly, evenly. This isn't about what you feel, it's about what I decide. The lease, the trust, the rules that Uncle Richard set, they're not up for debate. You will honor them. You will delete the post you made years ago. You will comply with the terms of the lease. No negotiation, no excuses, no reinterpretation of the past. She stared, momentarily speechless. For the first time, I noticed how small her carefully curated confidence appeared against the weight of truth and consequence. She realized, though perhaps not fully, that her ability to control, manipulate, or erase me had ended. I did not shout. I did not gloat. I simply let the silence fill the space, allowing her to feel, in full, the impact of the choices she had made. I can't post a correction, she whispered. Her voice faltered, unpracticed. People will know I lied. That is your reality, I said gently, yet firmly. The world will see the consequences of your decisions. I am not responsible for rewriting history for you. I am only responsible for living mine. She nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, and sank back into the chair. The room was still. Gerald and Patricia were absent this time. This was between the two of us. In that quiet, I understood that power isn't loud, doesn't shout, and doesn't humiliate. It is exercised through clarity, consistency, and the courage to enforce boundaries even when the other person resists. I let her sit there for a few moments, absorbing the truth. Then I stood, walked to the side table, and glanced at the envelope from Uncle Richard. It wasn't about money or property. It was about recognition, authority, and the right to exist on my own terms. Your presence here doesn't grant you influence, I said softly. It simply allows you to see what you've lost. I turned and walked toward the porch, leaving her to process, and stepped into the crisp air. The maples swayed, gold against gray. Quiet justice, I realized, had nothing to do with triumph or anger. It had everything to do with standing firmly in your own story. The week after Meredith's visit, I realized something fundamental. Reclaiming my life wasn't a single confrontation. It was a series of consistent choices, each one reinforcing the boundaries I had fought so hard to establish. The Maple Street cottage lease was signed, the trust was clear, and now, it was time for the broader framework of my family to understand their limits. I called Helen Marsh to confirm that all communications regarding Richard's estate and the properties would go through her office. She nodded, familiar with the rhythm of this family's pattern. They'll have to respect your authority, Dulce, she said calmly. The structure prevents manipulation. The trust and the lease are ironclad. I prepared a brief note, carefully worded, for Gerald and Patricia. No accusation, no drama, just the facts. The lease, their responsibilities, the trust, and my authority over it all. I sent it via certified mail and email. I didn't expect gratitude, acknowledgement, or apology. I expected compliance. That alone was revolutionary. Meredith remained silent. Her Facebook account stayed deactivated, and attempts to reach her via phone went unanswered. The absence wasn't triumph, it was natural consequence. The stage she had once curated, the narrative she had rewritten so carefully, no longer existed. Her choices and their ripple effects had caught up quietly but inevitably. Each day, as I moved through the routine I had built, morning tea on the porch, physical therapy, work, walks around the neighborhood, I felt the weight of freedom settle in. The house, the envelope, the trust, even the signed lease, were all symbols of the authority I had inherited and earned. They reminded me that my life was no longer subject to the whims of a family that had once defined me by cost, inconvenience, or absence. Uncle Richard continued his Sunday visits, bringing stories and presents rather than guidance or judgment. Nora's weekend visits became laughter-filled respites from years of silence and erasure. Aunt Carol's phone calls remained gentle and affirming, bridging history with understanding. These connections, chosen and nurtured, reinforced the principle I had come to live by. Presence matters, but only when it's consistent and grounded in respect. I walked the property at dusk, tea in hand, Buckley at my side. The sugar maples swayed, their gold leaves shimmering against a gray sky. a quiet reminder that life could flourish even after years of neglect. I reflected on the boundaries I had established, not as walls built to punish, but as safeguards to protect the life I was finally living on my own terms. For the first time, I felt steady, not triumphant, not vengeful, just firmly anchored in clarity. Every choice, every action, every boundary enforced quietly reminded me of the truth I had claimed. I existed for myself first. And that, in its calm endurance, was more powerful than any drama my family had ever created. In the weeks that followed, the rhythms of daily life at Maple Street began to settle, not just for me but for the rest of the family. I didn't orchestrate it. I didn't need to. I simply maintained the boundaries I had established and let the natural consequences play out. Gerald and Patricia followed the lease terms without dispute, though I could sense the subtle discomfort in their movements, the way they measured each step, each gesture, now aware that control was no longer theirs. Meredith remained absent. Her social media silence was deafening in its own way. Friends who had once rallied to her side began asking questions, realizing that the carefully crafted narrative she had presented was no longer credible. Without an audience, her influence faltered. She no longer had the stage to rewrite reality, to erase me or manipulate my parents' perception. Watching this unfold, I felt no triumph, only the quiet, steady assurance that the boundaries I had enforced were working as intended. I continued to build my own life, unhurried and deliberate. Mornings on the porch with Buckley, physical therapy sessions, short walks through the neighborhood, time with Nora, and Sunday dinners with Uncle Richard, each act reinforced the life I had claimed for myself. These routines were simple, but they carried weight. They represented independence, consistency, and the steady reclaiming of my own narrative. I received subtle updates from Aunt Carol, who remained a quiet witness to the family's slow reckoning. Gerald had begun to realize, in small, uncomfortable increments, that his previous habits of prioritizing image and control over care had consequences he could no longer avoid. Patricia, too, carried a quiet tension, a recognition that the neglect of my health and presence could not be undone. They were facing the natural outcome of years of misaligned priorities, and I observed it without intervention. The envelope from Uncle Richard sat on the side table, a constant reminder not of wealth, but of choice and recognition. It symbolized more than property or legal documents. It symbolized the life I had fought to claim, the authority I now wielded over my own story. Every glance at it reinforced my understanding that true power is measured not in reaction, but in steadfast clarity. Walking the yard in the late afternoon, the sugar maples swayed in the breeze, their gold and copper leaves glittering against the gray sky. I felt a sense of deep calm, anchored by the knowledge that I had chosen myself first, and that my family, through their actions and the natural consequences, had finally begun to understand the limits of their influence. For the first time, I realized that the most profound lessons often arrive quietly, without spectacle, without confrontation. They come through observation, consistency, and the steady assertion of one's own worth. And in that quiet unfolding, I found a lasting peace that had once seemed impossible. The weeks turned into months, and the Maple Street house slowly became more than just a place to live. It became a sanctuary. Every morning I stepped onto the porch with my mug of tea, the crisp air filling my lungs. I felt the quiet assurance that my life was mine to shape. Buckley patted around my feet, nudging gently, reminding me that some presences are steady and dependable if you let them be. Work became a rhythm I could trust. The small accounting firm recognized my contributions, never questioning my past or my worth. Each spreadsheet, each financial report filed, carried a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with my family's judgment. For the first time, my efforts were measured by results and integrity, not by comparison or conditional approval. Uncle Richard continued his Sunday visits, his presence calm, warm, and deliberate. We shared meals, sometimes spoke, sometimes didn't. The quiet of the room, the normalcy of routine, felt like a balm for years of tension and neglect. Nora's weekend visits brought laughter and ease. Aunt Carol's calls remained a steady tether to the part of my family that had never tried to erase me. Together, these threads formed a tapestry of chosen connections, ones grounded in respect and care rather than obligation or manipulation. I watched my parents, Gerald and Patricia, navigate the cottage. They paid rent, followed the lease, and experienced the subtle but unrelenting consequences of past choices. Meredith remained distant, removed from her former stage, her carefully curated audience gone. I observed it all without gloating or anger. There was no need. Reality had a quiet way of teaching lessons when left undisturbed. I spent hours in the yard tending the garden tomatoes, herbs, a few wildflowers. Each plant, nurtured patiently, mirrored the work I had done on my own life. Careful, deliberate, enduring. Life didn't demand spectacle or recognition. It only demanded attention and respect, both of which I could now give myself freely. The envelope from Uncle Richard remained on the side table, untouched yet ever present. It represented more than wealth or property. It symbolized recognition, authority, and the validation that someone had chosen me when my own family had not. That quiet acknowledgement became a foundation on which every choice, every boundary, every act of independence rested. As autumn deepened, the sugar maples turned a brilliant gold and copper, leaves falling in slow spirals to the ground. I stepped onto the porch one evening, tea in hand, and allowed myself to simply observe. The world continued, my family continued, and yet I had created a space in which my life could thrive on its own terms. For the first time in years, I understood that healing isn't about revenge or correction. It's about choosing yourself, consistently, patiently, and deliberately. And in that deliberate quiet, I found freedom, a life that belongs to me, anchored in clarity and steady, enduring peace. A year had passed since Gerald, Patricia, and Meredith moved into the Maple Street cottage. Life at the Litchfield house had settled into a quiet rhythm I had never known before. Mornings began the same way, tea in hand, Buckley at my feet, sunlight slowly brushing the porch. My chest had healed further. The pale silver scar was a silent reminder of survival and the autonomy I had reclaimed. Work felt steady and grounding. Each spreadsheet, each report, reminded me that my contributions mattered on their own merit, not based on anyone else's approval. My colleagues recognized me for what I did, not what I had endured. The distinction, subtle as it was, felt liberating. The family was adjusting to the consequences naturally. Gerald and Patricia followed the lease, paying rent, observing the rules. Meredith remained absent from social media, her audience gone, her carefully curated stage vanished. I watched it quietly, without gloating, understanding that consistent boundaries and clarity often speak louder than confrontation. Uncle Richard continued his Sunday visits, bringing stories, presents, and stability. Nora's weekend visits provided laughter and companionship. Aunt Carol's calls remained steady, tethering me to family who had never abandoned me. These relationships were chosen and nurtured, built on respect rather than obligation. Evenings were often spent tending the garden, walking the yard, or sitting on the porch watching the sugar maples sway, gold and copper against a gray sky. Each leaf, each plant, reflected the principle I had learned over the years. Growth and strength require attention, patience, and care. The envelope from Uncle Richard still sat on the side table, its significance no longer tied to wealth or property, but to the quiet validation that someone had chosen me when my own family had not. One evening, sipping tea and watching the last leaves fall, I understood something essential. Peace is quiet, not loud. Strength is steady, not performative. The most profound victories are measured in boundaries upheld, choices honored, and the courage to live life on your own terms. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever felt overlooked or erased, know this: reclaiming your life quietly is possible. You don't have to wait for others to validate your worth. Share where you're listening from, and let others know that standing firm in your story is a courageous and lasting choice. Autumn had fully arrived over Litchfield. The sugar maples along the driveway glowed gold and copper, leaves drifting slowly to the ground. I stood on the porch, tea in hand, feeling the crisp air against my face. The Litchfield house had become more than a home. It was a space I had built entirely on my own terms, each corner reflecting choices I had made and boundaries I had enforced. Work was steady. The firm valued my results, my diligence, and never questioned my family or past. Each day felt anchored, free from judgment or expectation. I measured success by accomplishment alone, not approval. Uncle Richard's Sunday visits, Nora's weekend laughter, and Aunt Carol's warm calls reminded me that family could exist through respect, choice, and care, not obligation. These relationships, cultivated deliberately, anchored me in stability. From the porch, I glimpsed the cottage where Gerald, Patricia, and Meredith lived. They followed the rules, quiet and careful, navigating the boundaries I had set. Their gradual adjustment to these limits was a subtle, inevitable consequence of years of neglect. I observed without interference, understanding that the lessons they faced were natural and unforced. Evenings were spent tending the garden, walking the yard, or sitting quietly with Buckley at my feet. Each plant, each leaf, reminded me that growth requires patience, care, and consistency. The envelope from Uncle Richard rested silently on the side table, a reminder that someone had chosen me, affirmed my worth, and created a structure for me to thrive. Its presence was no longer validation, it was quiet assurance. For the first time, I realized that living fully, deliberately, and calmly on my own terms was the truest form of resolution. Peace, I understood, doesn't shout, it endures.